is now the time to be compromising on carbon emissions. EU environment ministers met on Tuesday, hot on the heels of a new UN climate report that warns it may already be too late to reverse the acceleration of global warming. And after 13 hours of talks, one of those vintage late-night EU compromises, this one to curb CO2 emissions for cars to 35% of their 2021 levels by 2030, by the year 2030. The European Parliament wanted 40%. Germany, egged on by automakers, led the charge to keep the target at 30. We're going to pay attention to the fine print, especially when it comes to vans and trucks, and weigh the arguments of a conflicted continent where citizens want to both save the planet in the long run, but who like those bigger model cars for now. The Germans themselves are conflicted. Lawmakers may be siding with industry on this one, but a German court on Tuesday came down in favor of the city of Berlin's diesel engine ban. In other countries like Australia and the US, leaders are shrugging off the call to change our habits before it's too late. The US Supreme Court Tuesday refused to review a case that lifts restrictions on hydrofluorocarbons, gases that are used in appliances such as refrigerators. Yes, the answer out of Washington these days is to let the private sector regulate itself. We'll see if our panel agrees. Today in the France 24 debate, is the change not fast enough? And joining us, Nicolas Méran, energy and transport consultant with electric vehicle advocates EV Volumes. You're also advising the French Prime Minister's office on these issues of making the transition.
Yes.
Thank you for being with us. I want to thank as well from Munich to welcome back Douglas Baldock, managing editor for Automotive News Europe. And there's both sides of the conversation speaking out where you are this Wednesday. Thanks for being with us. Joining us from the University of Lancaster, Denis Chala is with us as well. Thank you for joining the conversation.
Hello, everyone.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Before we talk about European car emissions, why don't we state the evidence with the latest from the Florida Panhandle, Hurricane Michael, a Category 4 storm, stoked by warm waters in the Gulf of Mexico, 28, close to 29 degrees, those waters. Well, it's making landfall as we speak with perhaps the most powerful hurricane ever to hit that area since they started making records. You know, the increase in instances of extreme weather can only rise, warned those climate scientists who came out with their report on Monday. They spell out the difference if the Earth temperature rises by an average of 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2 degrees. Denis Chala, let me begin with you. Your reaction to these incidents of extreme weather that we're witnessing.
I think it is important to connect the extreme weather events to climate change, because it's not just the sea surface that is warming, there's also the sea ice that is melting. And I think there is a clear connection. And scientists have many times underlined very strongly that we should shoot for 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees. And then I very much welcome that this has been also put forward by the IPCC. I think it's very important.
Is it already too late when you look at that report from Monday?
I think you can say that it's already too late. So there have been numerous studies that say that we should essentially peak emissions by 2030, and from then onwards we should just drop to zero very fast by 2050 or by 2040, according to some reports. It is important to underline that it's a monumental effort. It's not impossible, but it's going to take a very big effort.
It's going to take a very big effort, and of course that brings us to that Tuesday night compromise in Luxembourg, where those environment ministers were meeting. The result, not enough for some, too much for others. Yuka Royer has more.
It's the biggest warning from the science community yet, a call for action. The IPCC's report is clear. Urgent and unprecedented changes are needed to keep global temperatures from rising to unbearable levels.
limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is not impossible, but will require unprecedented transitions in all aspects of society. There are clear benefits to...
Okay, that's not the report we wanted to show you. We'll try to bring you that report by Yuka Royer in a moment. The European Environment Ministers meeting, the compromise that was fleshed out, and it was fleshed out at the behest of Austria, which holds the rotating presidency of the European Council, 35%. So between these tougher standards that had been pushed by some states and what Germany wanted, which was to remain at this target of trying to reach 30% less when it comes to fuel emissions by the year 2030, based on what we've got for models for 2021. Nicolas Mélan, your thoughts? Too much or not enough?
Well, if you look back at 2015 when we signed the Paris Agreement and everybody believed that maybe the planet would be saved, what would the Paris Agreement need to be implemented? 60% by 2030.
60% in the reduction for all vehicles?
For new cars. So if we wanted to be in line with what the Paris Agreement says, it would be 60%.
Because here on the European continent, the lion's share of CO2 emissions comes from transport.
Exactly, about one fourth of CO2 emission come from transport, 12% from cars. But what is important is that transport is the only sector where it increased compared to 1990 level by as many as 23%. So this is where we have a really hard time to decrease CO2 emission. And if we look at the past 15 years, actually the CO2 emission on the paper on new cars decreased by 30%. But the truth is, on the road, it was only 1/3 of this. So 10%, because vehicle manufacturers played with different loophole and flexibilities in car test to decrease it in the lab, but not on the road.
And we have these new emission standards that are going to be coming into effect. So actually the data we're going to get is going to become more damning.
So we have a new test, which is being implemented right now as we speak, but it doesn't ensure for the time being that vehicle manufacturers won't be able to use some other flexibilities and avoid decreasing CO2 emission in real life. So it's 35% on the paper, but what will it be on the road? Will it be 10? Or will it be more than this? And for having a sufficient reduction, you need to be able to go and do some tests on the road, on the car, to make sure you have the same value as what you have on the test.
And we're only going to know what in the coming year?
Well, there is some discussion now being implemented at the European Commission. One of the suggestions is to implement each and every new car by 2021 with kind of a black box, which will measure your fuel consumption and send the data to an authority, which will gather...
How much will that cost?
Well, it's not probably a big cost, but it will ensure that each and every year, the fleet which is sold by the vehicle manufacturer, the value that they get on the road is not too far from the value that they get in the lab.
And of course, after the diesel cheating scandal that we had that engulfed many of the European makers, people are wary of the science they're getting. Once again, let's take a look at what exactly the compromise itself entails with our own Yuka Royer.
Torn between tackling pollution and protecting the auto industry, EU ministers settled for a compromise. After 13 hours of talks, they agreed to seek a 35% cut in CO2 emissions for new cars by 2030, compared to the 2021 models, and 30% for vans. 20 of the 28 members supported the new target, 4 voted against and 4 abstained. Some countries like France, Ireland and the Netherlands wanted a higher reduction of 40%, in line with targets approved by EU lawmakers last week. But Germany, backed by some Eastern European countries, pushed for a more lenient target to maintain the industry's competitiveness. Europe's auto powerhouse produced 5.6 million cars last year, more than double the volume in Spain and triple that of France. Berlin is concerned a more ambitious target would harm the industry and its 820,000 workers. Automakers had argued a 40% CO2 reduction in just over a decade would be next to impossible.
And we like ambitious goals in the industry, and we welcome to further reduce CO2 emissions with our cars, but we also want to make sure that goals and reduction targets on CO2 emissions which are set are realistic and that we can deliver them.
The European Parliament and the European Commission will begin talks on Wednesday to try and finalise the new rules to be imposed on car makers.
Douglas Bolduc, what's your religion? Is it mission impossible trying to reduce those CO2 emissions on new vehicles by 40%?
Well, we heard the same story in the past when it was bringing the emissions down to 130 grams per kilometer and the 95 grams per kilometer. They were both going to be the end of the world, and yet we've seen those at least 130 grams was achieved early. That goal was achieved early. The issue that we're dealing with right now is we're talking about all kinds of different emissions. And again, with the diesel cars, you can reduce CO2. We saw reductions in CO2 when there was a big push on diesel cars. But now with the move away from them because of the Volkswagen scandal that you mentioned, and other automakers have been involved in being found out to not being so completely honest with their emissions results. Well, that's put pressure on the diesel, and that's increased the CO2. And we saw that with the latest statistics. So it is going to be difficult. But I mean, again, one of the things that the automakers rightly say is that, hey, you know what? Give us a goal, but don't pick the technology. Give us a number and we will achieve it. But when you automatically start banning diesels and doing those kinds of things, and you start pulling technologies out of the equation, that's really that's like changing the rules of the game in the middle of the race.
Changing the rules in the middle of the race. You heard Nicolas Mélan express reservations about the loopholes in the agreement that was fleshed out in Luxembourg late Tuesday. Do you agree?
Well, I mean, again, the great thing, we saw it with the old regulations, the NEDC, and now the move towards the real world emissions. Everyone's going to always find a loophole, and we've spoken to I mean, again, at this publication, a number of automaker executives say, we're not going to reduce unless we're told to reduce. And if there are ways to sort of make their results even better, then that's definitely going to continue to happen. But those loopholes are getting are closing with the real driving emissions tests, compared with the bench tests, which and some of the crazy things they were doing to get the results. I think one of the other panelists mentioned that what they were saying they were reducing by 30%, but at the end of the day, it was really only 10%. That's going to be harder to do with the real world testing. But the interesting thing is that if there's a test, there's a way to game it.
If there's a test, there's a way to game it. Dennis Challa, first of all, let me ask you, for people who don't follow this very closely, why the lighter targets for commercial vehicles?
I think it's because it's much more difficult to decarbonize heavier sort of goods-carrying vehicles. But then, as my fellow panelists said, this is mostly due to the mandated battery electric vehicle technology, because then they would have to carry the weights of the batteries themselves, so greatly reducing the space. So I think that might be the reasons. But I would also like to push back on my fellow panelists saying that mandated technology is not necessarily the way to go, since I think the electricity generation sector and the transportation sector is becoming increasingly more and more entangled. And this is something that we must not forget.
Explain to us mandated technology.
So I think if you would put EVs in the law as to replace the existing internal combustion engines, then you could call that mandated technology. But then you have to build up the electricity infrastructure to supply those EVs with energy. So it has to be some kind of a discussion going on, I believe.
Nicolas Mélan?
Yeah, I think we were talking about 35% is this goal which is achievable. I mean, there is different way to meet this target, and a country which actually already meeting the 2021 target is called Norway. Target is 95 grams in 2021 in Europe, but in Norway there was at this target in 2016. And how do they do that? Well, they have a fiscal incentives which encourage people to buy electric vehicles because it's cheaper than a regular car. And so today, as we speak, 1 car out of 2 in Norway sold is electric. And this will be an important step. But the second important step is that the EU has an environmental plan. That's a great thing. But they don't have an industrial plan. How will Europe provide all those electric vehicles? What we see today, as we speak, we published a report with France Stratégie earlier this year, and we've seen that now China controls the battery production for electric vehicles, and battery is half of the price. And Europe is realizing that they lost this opportunity, and they need to work on the next one, which is in 2025 or even later. So if tomorrow we want to have all electric vehicles, but we all buy them from China, does it really make any sense?
And it becomes a question of industrial strategy, might even say of a national security almost. We're going to be talking about that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking in the same week that's seen UN climate scientists sound an even more stringent alarm when it comes to the overheating of the planet. EU environment ministers agreeing to a compromise on toughening targets for auto emissions. With us to talk about it, Nicolas Mélan, consultant with electric vehicle consultants, or advocates, you could say. EV Volumes, also an advisor to the Prime Minister's panel on science, France Stratégie. Joining us from Munich, Douglas Bolduc. He is the managing editor at Automotive News Europe, and from the University of Lancaster. Welcome back to Dennis Chala. Now, despite more efficient vehicles, carbon emissions, by the way, up here in France this past year on newly registered vehicles, bigger gas guzzlers, and a spike in US-style pickup trucks are also starting to make a dent. Nicolas, the French want bigger cars, and
well, it's not, I think, only the French people. I think it's everybody. In China, 1 car out of 2 is an SUV. In Europe, it's about 1 out of 3, and that's the biggest problem, because what we see with not only the decrease in the diesel vehicle market share and the increase in the SUV is that it impacts all the emission of the vehicles, not only in France, but across Europe. So it's a big challenge for vehicle manufacturers. Will have to meet their target in 2021.
Dennis Chala, Barack Obama, when he was president, once quipped that the real way to lower CO2 emissions would be to raise the price of gas to $4 a gallon.
Yeah, I think this is a difficult debate because you can put a price on, as we have it in Europe, on actual emissions, but you can also put sort of an indirect tax as you deploy more and more renewable energy that would come back to the people, and you would be paying more for gas. But perhaps somebody else has a better answer to this.
Let me ask you about this, Douglas Bolduc. Again, in the light of the compromise that was reached in Luxembourg late on Tuesday, does Europe have it right of how to go about meeting its CO2 targets?
Well, I mean, something has to be done, and the EU has been aggressively pursuing an attempt to reduce the CO2. And as we were mentioning before, the strong push and the strong belief behind the diesel was great in helping that, because diesels are much more fuel efficient than gasoline cars. But now, as the diesel has been basically considered the scourge of the earth, everyone's moving to gasoline because, I mean, again, you've got pretty much any buyer in Germany worried about being banned from driving into the city limits. So these factors have had a major impact on the increase, and has really put the automakers in a position where they know they have to electrify the powertrain. Some have been aggressively moving in that direction. We're going to see more mild hybrids. We're going to see more plug-in hybrids. We're going to see more full electric vehicles. You can't change it overnight. I think one of the other panelists mentioned that, you're talking about our European industry. If we're only getting the batteries from China, that becomes a big problem. Fortunately, there is some push to increase the number of batteries that are going to be made here in Europe. And another thing that we were talking about, I mean, if we're getting all of this energy for all of these electric cars or plug-in hybrids, I mean, I know in Germany, I think it's only 33% of the energy is green. So all the other energy is coming from coal. Are we really going to be making a great improvement to the air we breathe? No.
All right, Europe, which spews some 9% of the planet's carbon emissions, for a population that's fallen below 6%. There you see the graph showing how since, well, the middle of the 18th century, our appetite for fossil fuels has grown exponentially. Dennis Jala, when you look ahead now, what is Europe targeting the right area here, looking at cars?
I think it is. As you mentioned, transportation is one of the lion's shares in emissions. And a lot of this, I think, is happening already almost organically. A lot of countries have already issued either mandated or sort of guidelines in terms of banning sales of internal combustion vehicles altogether. I know France has a plan by 2040. UK has a plan by 2040. So I think this 35% might come as a shock, but overall, I think Europe is already heading in the good track, in a good direction already.
Yeah, and as those environment ministers were hammering out a compromise in Luxembourg, a court on Tuesday siding with the city of Berlin. Its authorities want the upholding of a ban on diesel on major arteries, and barring an appeal, could be in place by the summer. Berlin to follow in the footsteps of Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Stuttgart with exclusion zones.
This is the federal capital. The millions of people who live here have a right to clean air. So next spring, diesel bans must be implemented in Berlin.
Douglas Bolduc, you're not in Berlin, you're in Munich. But I can tell you here, as a cyclist in Paris, sometimes I do get sick of breathing in some of those fumes. Your thoughts on that court decision Tuesday?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, it's indisputable when you are in a major city that, I mean, the air is pretty thick. Now, I mean, again, if you compare the air we have in Europe to other parts of the world, whether it be China or in India, it's not even, you can't even compare it. You feel like you're in the mountains in comparison to those markets. But we're talking about Europe, and things that are being done are the right things because it's just good for the overall health of the people. But again, one of the strong arguments that continues to be made is that you have to balance it, and you have to sort of have a plan. It's almost sometimes these regulations come upon the industry almost like a punishment. And so maybe it's that way because it need to sort of get people active and to make the right steps and to really start making those changes. But I mean, again, you cannot argue with the fact that when you are in a major city, breathing in the air can make you feel ill.
Nicolas Ménon?
Well, whether in Germany or in most European capitals, the air has been exceeding the limit on nitrogen dioxide for the last 8 years. and nothing has been done. So Germany...
It seems to be getting worse in a way, right?
It's not getting worse. We over for the last 8 years. It's stable.
Maybe it feels like that because Paris is in a bowl, and as soon as there's no wind, it sits.
Are you more sensitive to it? But the truth is, in Germany, this is exactly the kind of decision that can get us to the 35%. Why? Because if you start to ban diesel and only allow electric vehicles in cities, this is when people are going to start to buy those cars, even if they are more expensive, because then it gives them access to the city, whatever the price is, I would say. So this is something very interesting. You'll see this more and more in Germany because it is a court decision. It's not the mayor of Berlin who says, I want to improve my hair and I'm going to do this. He doesn't have the choice. He doesn't want to do it, but he's going to have to do it by a court decision.
It's a story not just of science, and it's also a story of politics here, isn't it, Douglas Bolduc? Because here you have the courts standing up and making this decision. Of course, in the United States, again, on Tuesday, we had the Supreme Court refusing to hear arguments about those gases that create HFCS, that create more and more global warming.
Yeah, I mean, again, different countries with different policies on how they want to make the reductions in those gases that are basically coming back and hurting us. I mean, and it's interesting, we're mentioning the electric car a number of times. I tested an electric car during the course of this summer. I love the idea of that, and I love the idea of being able to get around emissions-free. The performance of the car was fantastic. But one of the arguments that the industry has been making is that there is no infrastructure to support this, and so that's one of the problems that they're dealing with. And is it their responsibility to do it? I mean, again, we had to run a long extension cord in order to charge up the vehicle. It was the nightmare that everyone fears. And when I got the car, it only had 10 more kilometers of range before I had to plug it in. So running around looking for a plug, we all know what it's like with our phones and our computers. And when you have to do that with your car, it's a whole new level of distress.
Yeah, it's. Did you get the sense of that where you are in the UK, Dennis Challa? I was at a rest area in southern England a few weeks ago, and there was a woman who lived 5 kilometers away who'd come just to charge her car.
I think I would say actually that it's completely the opposite the case in the UK, where the infrastructure is long ahead in terms of diffusion than cars. And I know there's a particular company who's operating these charging stations scattered across the motorways of the UK, and they actually don't see enough utilization. So I agree, it is a political problem, but I think in some countries, not even talking about Norway, for example, infrastructure is well ahead of EV diffusion.
Yeah, and we're talking about Germany because it's the #1 economy in Europe, and it's not just Berlin, it's not just cars there, by the way. Over the weekend, there were 50,000 protesters headed to the ancient Hambach forest west of Cologne to save 1,000-year-old trees from the chop. The courts issuing a temporary order barring energy giant RWE from clearing the trees to make way for a coal mine. Douglas Bolduc, we saw Angela Merkel praise that compromise that was reached in Luxembourg this Wednesday. But you could tell it was, how should I say, a tight smile she showed. Her own government is conflicted over this. Just how divided is Germany right now?
I mean, it's a difficult time because, again, trying to balance the power of the economy, which is driven by jobs, and coal plays a factor in that. And we know the automotive industry, if I'm not mistaken, 1 out of 7 jobs in this country are related, can somehow draw a line to automotive. when you start talking about putting that at risk, I mean, the number of livelihoods and the number of people that have the potential to be impacted, that's a difficult balancing act because those are all voters, and if you know, whichever party it's going to be is going to have a chance to move forward and to lead, they've got to balance those things and making sure that there are jobs, good paying and long-term jobs for people, but I mean, not completely and totally at the expense of the environment. Because I mean, again, if that you know is not protected, then you can't you can't fix it later.
Nicolas Mélan, that balance between the short term and the long term, growth in the short term, stopping the planet from overheating in the long term. We see how the Germans are grappling with it. We see, for instance, this coming Sunday in regional elections in Bavaria, the Greens are expected to fare very well. Here in France, we had this spectacular resignation of the environment minister, who is arguably Emmanuel Macron's most popular cabinet member. Kind of seems to have blown over. We're not really talking much about the environment here as much as they are in Germany.
Yeah, definitely the Germans are more sensitive to this topic. We had, of course, Nicolas Hulot was charismatic, but now that he left, it's kind of an empty space.
Why isn't it more of an issue? Why isn't it more of an issue in France?
I think people are not really familiar with what's really going on. I mean, I mentioned earlier the European Commission need to have a plan, an industrial plan to go on this road to decrease emission. One thing which people never say, and which is kind of an inconvenient truth, is that how did we reduce CO2 emissions over the last 20 years in France, in Europe? We closed factories in Europe, we opened them somewhere else. That's how we decrease CO2 emission. And that's not a plan. And if we do the same, tomorrow we close all the plants in Germany and we open them in China, our emissions are going to reduce, but overall it will increase as the planet, and CO2 is a planet problem. And so today, it's very simple to reach this objective of 35%, very simple. You just need to put two things.
Go ahead.
It's very easy. Over the last 20 years, the only time where CO2 emission for cars declined is when people buy smaller cars. And so the power went down and the mass went down. And so it's very easy. You just replicate what Norway is doing. Instead of only looking at CO2 emission, you put fiscal incentive on CO2, mass, and power. And based on that, you encourage people to buy smaller car, to buy less powerful car, and your CO2 emission will decrease, and you don't even have to check on real road on test, because you impact the cause of the CO2 emissions.
Nicolas, don't go to the Paris Auto Show, which is on right now, because you won't like what you see. What's there front and center are, again, those bigger models.
Yeah, I agree, but everybody wants bigger models. But at some point, if we are serious, and it's a big if we are serious about climate change, I mean, we can't all drive electric tanks like Tesla X or Audi e-tron or Mercedes EQC. Those are nice cars, but they weigh more than 2 tons. Do we need that to move our 70 kilos?
Dennis Chal, your reaction to the debate that's going on in Germany, especially when it comes to the issue of coal?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that if you try to decarbonize transportation, then this has to go hand in hand with how are you going to provide that electricity. And if that electricity is provided from coal power plants, that's also not good, and it might even increase the life cycle emissions. So, but of course, this is a parallel and perhaps similarly challenging in size debate to this. So yes, you need to have a renewable energy deployment policy in parallel with that, and you should not fuel the electric cars through coal.
When the UN climate report came out on Monday, Australia, which gets 2/3 of its energy from coal, quick to react through its environment minister, Melissa Price, saying, "We make no apology for the fact that our focus at the moment is getting electricity prices down." Dennis Chal, it probably won't surprise you to hear that she used to work for the coal industry. And again, this issue is a lot about politics and how much lobbies weigh on all the policies that are made. Your thoughts on that when it comes to this continent?
Yeah, I think this is a very difficult debate, and because in a lot of cases, from the price argument, renewable energy matches the price of fossil fuels. I know here in the UK, for example, offshore wind is perhaps the cheapest form of energy. But definitely there's sort of a lock-in effect where you have built many power plants up over a long time, and then you have the entire mining industry attached to that. They're going to have a very significant lobbying power. So it's a very difficult discussion to have.
Nicolas Mélan?
Something very interesting in the UK actually is that they used to produce 35% of the electricity from coal 4 or 5 years ago, like it's the case now in Germany. And in only 4 years, they get rid of all the coal in electricity completely, just by putting a carbon tax of 20 euro per ton on the electricity. And this is what, if each and every country in the world would be able to put this tax, would be much better off on the Paris Agreement, and we could have instead one chance to meet the targets.
Douglas Baldock, you agree?
Well, I mean, again, it's interesting. You mentioned the push from the lobbyists. It reminds me of a sign that my dad had in his office. It said, "Don't forget the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules." So oftentimes that's what's pushing some of these decisions. But just like the other panelists said, the minute that government decides, okay, we're going to make a change here, then you got to get in lockstep and make that change, and things you can't see things happen. I mean, a lot of times the automakers have been dragged into a lot of the things, the improvements that have come, the reductions have come because the governments have said, look, we have to reduce this, and here's the target. And so there is some push from those types of programs and those types of requirements. But like we constantly see, even with this last week, with that there also you have a lot of strong players with multi-billions at stake and strong lobbying fronts and strong voting blocks. So trying to keep that all balanced and keep everybody happy, that's a pretty hard job. But I mean, again, you just have to keep on trying to make those improvements because ultimately we're talking about everyone's overall health.
Douglas Baldock in Munich, Dennis Challa in Lancaster. I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Nicolas Mélan. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And this is an argument that, well, has gone into overdrive online as well. Let's say hello to Emma James.
Hi there. Yes, absolutely. And it does seem that everything in the world right now is incredibly polarized. And even in the face of what seems like overwhelming evidence, climate change is divisive too. The Onion, the satirical publication, has come up with this piece today. "Can anyone hear me?" shout terrified climate scientists, frantically waving arms as passers-by walk straight through them. It is satire, obviously, but it does seem to echo what a lot of people are saying. They basically say in this article that the scientists have resorted to these measures because they're panicked that the American public remains oblivious to their efforts and the things that they have proved. That's satire. This is a real headline. "Wake up, world leaders. The alarm is deafening," says the New York Times. That's from their editorial board. It is, of course, reacting to this UN report, which gave us all these dire warnings that we have just 12 years to save the world from catastrophic sort of global problems, and basically the only way we can stop it is if we do it within 12 years. So that's from the New York Times, but there are headlines equally doom-laden everywhere.
And as our correspondent in Florida who's covering the arrival of Hurricane Michael was saying, ahead of the midterm elections, the politics is all just about storm preparedness. Not at all about this, about...
No, absolutely. It seems to be being swept under the carpet, almost as though there's no link between them. It's interesting that the New York Times chose to illustrate that particular article with this image of wildfires, one of the things that are set to get far worse if we can't get a handle on the rise in temperatures. Other doomsayers are Ricardo Lagos, the former Chilean president, who says climate change is a global health catastrophe. He says this isn't a challenge that we can leave to those climate scientists and environmental advocates. And he says it's not something that's happening in the future, it's something that's happening now. But he does seem to be screaming into the void, as The Onion really alluded to too. The Miami Herald reporting on a different report, not the UN report, but one that says there could be catastrophic effects on mental health if temperatures continue to rise. Basically, if it goes to above 2 degrees Celsius over the pre-industrial levels, then we will see a dramatic rise in suicides. And it's basically, they're not entirely sure why. They say it could be to do with the way it affects sleep patterns, it could be to do with your mood, it could be to do with the level of activity that you undertake. But they talk about catastrophic dips in mental health. So another very serious potential repercussion of this. However, the skeptics are still out there, of course, among them the President of the United States, Donald Trump, who asked about this UN report, you know, who drew it up, or who drew it, to use his exact phrase. It was given to me and I want to look at who drew it. You know which group drew it, because I can give you reports that are fabulous and reports that aren't so good. So clearly he is not walking away from his climate change skeptic attitudes that he's held for quite some time now. And he's not the only one, it has to be said. Fraser Nelson, who's the editor of The Spectator magazine in the United Kingdom, tweeted this: "How long do we have to save the Earth?" And it's clearly a rather tongue-in-cheek look at the number of times we've been told that we have a set amount of time to save the planet. 5 years, said the Worldwide Fund for Nature back in 2007. 5 years, said the International Energy Agency in 2011. And of course, we've already surpassed those dates. Now, of course, we have the IPCC saying 12 years. This gentleman replying very angry about it: "You published this as if to mock these projections. In many of the parts of the world where I and many others work, people are dying, going hungry and getting displaced because of climate change related crises." And that's one of the problems. The people who are most affected by this, they're not in the areas where you have huge coverage from the media. And so a lot of it is going uncommented upon. And people, those who don't believe in it, think that they just haven't seen enough of it and it's therefore not true. Some people are making a few jokes about the deniers. This gentleman saying climate change is fake, quoting Donald Trump. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go prepare for the 7th major hurricane of my less than 2-year presidency." Because, of course, Hurricane Michael is sweeping in as we speak. And it does, to people who believe the scientists, it does seem incredible that in the face of all this evidence, and not just scientific studies, but the evidence of our own eyes and television sets, it does seem incredible that people still want to write this off. This woman saying, "Everyone who thinks climate change is a hoax, who exactly do you think benefits from decreasing pollution? Big everyone?" Because, of course, when there's a hoax, usually somebody's blamed, whether it's big tech or big money or whoever. There's always someone to blame. But really, who can we argue is going to benefit if this is all just a hoax?
All right, and many thanks for that, Emma. We're going to continue this argument online and continue our coverage of Hurricane Michael and other environment issues on our website. Thank you very much. Thanks to our panel. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.